the nature of your emergency?
Welcome back to the Tactical Living Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Walton, joined by Sergeant Walton. Glenn, how are you?
I'm excellent.
I have a really interesting question, and I really don't think this will apply much to you, Clint, because you do so much self-work, but for a lot of people, it will. And the question here is, who were you before survival mode became your default setting?
That's a really good question, because when you start... we live in this survival mode on a regular basis and we don't even recognize it. And when you're always living in that fight or flight or that survival mode aspect, you don't know who you identify as without having that.
Yeah, before the hypervigilance, the emotional armor, before every decision carried weight and consequences for you, I think it's important for us to be able to just discuss how long-term exposure to high-stress environments, especially when you are a first responder, actually reshapes your identity, and how reconnecting with earlier parts of yourself can help to restore some of that balance, that meaning, that emotional depth without compromising your strength.
And I think that's why it's so important to have, people outside of your profession that have nothing to do with your line of work, and being able to create that relationship outside of your day-to-day, because when you're always surrounding yourself with that, because that's your comfort zone, and like we've talked about before, is that calm in the chaos. When it's chaotic, we feel calm, and when it's calm, we feel chaotic, and we don't want to live in that all the time. And when you surround yourself with those people that you're around with in the chaos all the time, it's hard to separate that.
You guys, our primal instincts have always been something that I have been fascinated by, because it's so interesting what happens to us, not only in our bodies, but in our minds, especially in order for us to make sure that, life doesn't kill us. Our bodies and minds are constantly trying to work towards that goal. And there's a psychological concept called survival identity dominance, and that's exactly what we're talking about today. And it happens when the traits that are needed in order to be able to endure chronic stress, like control, vigilance, emotional suppression, they begin to overshadow other aspects of your personality.
And I think when we live in that mindset all the time, we start actually, it's funny when you start really thinking about it, when you're living in that hypervigilant state, when you're living in this chaotic mindset all the time, because of our mindsets, that survivalist type mentality, is we're actually harming ourselves internally on a different level, because it leads to the high blood pressure, it leads to the high stressors, and it leads to all that stuff. And not being able to turn it on and off it can lead to long-term health problems when you don't effectively have that balance.
Survival identity dominance, in first responders, it looks like a lot of different things, but I think the first is that constant alertness. You can have difficulty accessing joy or even be playful like you once used to be. And you have this narrowed down emotional range. You probably know what I'm talking about. Yeah,
having this emotional response to where you're just kind of flatlining when it comes to anything and everything when you're at work and when you're at home, because you don't want to show emotion when you're out in the field, whether it's laughter, whether it's upset or angst, whatever it may be, to the public. When you're around your partners, you can show that, but when we come home, you don't turn that off. You still have that, to where you start feeling that loss of connection with your loved ones, because you're not able to further that emotional response.
You might also have a loss of curiosity or creativity. I'm thinking of an officer who about 2 years ago became a grandpa, and all the time he'll send me videos and pictures of different activities and just this childlike wonder that's clearly been reawakened in him. And I think it's so important for us to be able to recognize moments like that, because it exemplifies the importance of having things that you can turn to that have nothing to do with what you do for work.
And it's so funny that you even say that and bring that up, because I started thinking about this recently, and like recording videos for you. Like I'll help Ashley record some videos for, what she's working on, and I've always considered myself a not creative person at all. And doing these videos, I start having creativity come into my mind of how I can stage things a certain way, how I can set stuff up a little bit different and to make it look enhanced. And like, I really enjoy using my creative mind to be able to create those videos.
You know, I like that you mentioned this because it's something that I have been thinking about a lot lately, and just how far away from that we're getting because of our screens and because of technology. Because once upon a time, we used to have coloring books and a pack of markers, and that used to be our entire world, right? That creativity would just explode sheet after sheet after sheet. And eventually that gets taken away, but it can evolve into other things. If you go onto Google and you just Google like adult DIY projects or adult coloring books or adult bead sets, like there's so many people that are understanding the importance of just putting our minds, our thoughts, our energy, and our sight to our hands in motion of the things that we could just create on our own.
Yeah, and it's like when you're explaining that, I'm thinking of when's the last time I went outside and dug a dirt fort? And it's using your imagination, using your mind to be
the adult version of that would be like a
bunker.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's stuff like that. It gets your wheels turning out of your everyday normal of not using your creative brain, because ultimately the more you use your creative brain, I think it also helps with you getting to think outside the box, being able to branch out into thinking of different ways to solve problems that you could be faced with on a day-to-day basis.
There are some signs that will tell us if survival mode has actually taken over. And I think one of them could be that you don't remember what you enjoyed before the job. Something I've definitely struggled with is relaxation might feel unproductive or unsafe, or your identity feels narrowed to be able to function. And you might feel distant from your own emotions. We see that happen a lot. Or maybe you struggle to even imagine a future beyond what it is that you do for work.
And that's where, as time goes along, if you're not finding these avenues to be able to be productive outside of that fight or flight response, out of that survival mindset, you start cornering yourself more and more to where it's going to make it harder to get out of that mindset or to get out of that positioning than if you were to slowly work on it progressively throughout the years.
We invested $25,000 for a 2-day conference once upon a time. One thing that I remember during that conference, though, is that there was a conversation that had taken place to where the coach was talking about how one of his coaches had asked the question along the lines of like, when was the last time that you did something that made you happy, that you were truly having fun with? And it took him a while to be able to kind of dig through his past. And long ago, it was having fun with a bunch of the guys, and they were playing basketball. And I think that there are ways for us to be able to reconnect with ourselves safely and to ask ourselves, like, what are some of your old interests? And do it without any kind of expectation, because curiosity really matters more than your performance. So for me, I could tell you that some of those interests for me have always been things like singing, right? Like independently, like being by myself and just singing and drawing and poetry and doing anything that I can that's more on a creative edge, whether it's with paint or different modalities, anything with words, right? Reading books and just fueling myself. Expansion has always been incredibly important to me. So those would be some of my old interests.
And that's where, like for me, it's, fishing and having these experiences, like having outside the ordinary life experiences for travel and for going new places and seeing new things and taking adventures. Like it's so enjoyable. It's so important to find what it is for yourself to get you outside of your normal comfortable zone.
And I think we need to allow play without purpose. So joy doesn't have to be productive in order for it to be valuable. When
we put so much on ourselves and burden ourselves in our minds of bearing other people's emotional response towards things, or being hypervigilant, or having this is how I'm supposed to react in these situations, I think we hinder ourselves of furthering our creativity, our mindsets of this is okay to be this way.
In the last couple years, you and I have done a great job at this next one, which is to build identity outside of the job gradually. We've always done that. You've never been who you are for work. You are your own person, and you are not your job. But we have included our best friends more and more in our lives and their kids. And I think that our lives have become enriched as a result of that. Just being able to, and we did it gradually. It wasn't like, okay, these are our friends. We need to spend more time together. Let's hang out every weekend. It was more and more and more gradually that we began to incorporate our lives into one another's. And so much to the extent that now we're like, trying to talk about retirement plans together and building barndominiums and things like that. And so I think it's so valuable and really important to just build your identity outside of the job, even if you have to start out by doing things gradually.
Yeah, because if you take one step at a time, you're eventually going to end up at your goal point. You don't have to move ahead at a sprint to get there. You can slowly get to that point depending on the circumstance.
I hope you've gotten some value out of today's episode. If you have, do us a favor, drop a review, subscribe down below, and as always, know that I'm sending you a long, tight hug from my home to yours.